Welcome back to the Synapse Sessions. Today we're honored to host Dr. Richard Mooney, a professor of neurobiology at Duke University and the director of the Mooney Lab. Dr. Mooney is a leading figure in the study of how the brain transforms experiences into learning, perception, and behavior. His work focuses on the neural circuit mechanisms that support vocalizations in songbirds and in mice, offering key insights into how the brain enables communication. The Mooney Lab combines an extraordinary range of cutting-edge techniques to better understand these neural pathways that underlie learning and communication. Dr. Mooney, thank you for joining us for the EV Neuroscience Club Synapse Sessions. We're excited to learn from your experience and research in this amazing part of neuroscience.
Happy to be here, Srikar.
So, the first thing that I wanted to ask was, what drew you to the study of the brain?
Well, strong interest in biology for sure, but also an equally strong interest in music. And those two had a convergence in learning about hearing and the auditory system. And ultimately, if you follow the ear, you get into the brain.
Of course. And was there a particular event that led you down this path? Obviously, like a musically influenced background, but was there a specific experiment or discovery in your earlier days working with the brain that led you down this specific path of like vocal learning?
Of course, looking in hindsight, one can see cause and effect where there isn't any. But there were a couple really pivotal experiences, and one that I would highlight for this is that I was a student at the San Francisco Conservatory of Music, just a part-time student, but taking music classes and studying classical guitar really intensively in the early 80s. And I kind of saw the writing on the wall. I mean, I'm a good musician, not great. And I also found the full-time, this was after I graduated from college, the full-time pursuit of music a little bit uh, limiting. I'd always been able to do at least academic science coursework. And without that, I felt a little bit cut off from things I really found interesting. I happen to live about a block away from the UCSF Medical Center on Parnassus Avenue, and I walked up the hill uh, and went to the physiology department and got a brochure on the faculty, and there were two who were studying auditory systems, and one of those was a guy named Jim Hudspeth, who actually, unfortunately, just died a few days ago. Um, but he was really, really generous and hired me as a research assistant kind of on the spot. And frankly, he really took a chance with me. I mean, I didn't have really any experimental experience. And he gave me a place in his lab, and that introduced me to the biophysics of hearing because he studied mechanoelectrical transduction and sensory hair cells of the inner ear and introduced me to a scientist down in Caltech who he was good friends with, a guy named Mark Kanishi. And Kanishi is who I ended up doing my PhD work with. And Kanishi studied bird behavior, but particularly song learning behavior in Austrian songbirds. And that, grew into what I'm doing today.
Hmm. And I guess that sort of transitions into my next sentence. How would you summarize the work that you're doing today?
Well, the work that we are doing today, I mean, I am part of a group of scientists, um, postdocs, grad students, technicians, undergraduates. Collectively, I would really characterize three avenues of research. One has to do with um, the mechanisms of spontaneous uh, and natural learning of a complex behavior, birdsong. How does a juvenile bird self-assemble a song? I mean, part of it relies on the help of others. It has to have a model, to imitate a tutor song that it listens to and memorizes early in life. But then, pretty much all by itself, it goes off and practices and becomes masterful at singing. And a lot of what we're focused on right now are the brain mechanisms that support that practice and self-guided learning of vocal behavior, which I would, for this audience, really stress it's a lot like uh, important kinds of learning that humans display. Spontaneous learning for um, music, athletics, I think for verbal expression. Yeah, you need a model and it helps to have a teacher, but most of it's accomplished individually
Hmm.
and through an internal motivation to do it. And that really brings up the second major theme is what motivates you to generate the behavior in the first place. So this is really fundamental. It's not just a birdsong problem. It's not just a learning problem. What's the wellspring of behavior, of movement? And birdsong gives us a really nice way to study it because birds sing hundreds or thousands of times a day. They do it spontaneously. What is the motive force in terms of brain mechanism that drives that? So that's a second major theme. And the third is this really early kind of the social aspect of learning. I mentioned that the juvenile bird listens to and memorizes the song of an adult tutor. That's a flashbulb moment for a young bird. There's something really, really kind of like a bolt of lightning when a juvenile bird hears an adult tutor sing. Doesn't take very many uh, renditions of hearing the tutor song for the juvenile to form a very faithful memory of that song. So, what's going on in that pivotal moment? That's a kind of the third major focus. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. So your lab focuses on, or your group focuses on both songbirds and mice, with songbirds being vocal learners, as you've described, and mice typically not being viewed as learning the sounds they produce. So what do these two models sort of show when they are compared side by side?
A lot of similarity. The the brainstem mechanisms, the respiratory vocal premotor networks and motor networks are quite comparable. I mean, they're not exactly the same. The vocal organ in the bird is a specialized structure named the syrinx, which sits at the bifurcation of the trachea into the two bronchi. It's a bipartite structure that is below the level of the larynx, which is what we use to phonate and what mice also use to phonate. But despite those differences in the organization of the periphery, the brainstem mechanisms, or at least the networks, look pretty similar. Where you start to get divergence is in the incorporation of forebrain control over vocalization. And I have colleagues who work in mouse who will say, yeah, the forebrain does something, and it's active during vocalization for sure in mice, but it's just not as essential a component. And in fact, for most mammals, including non-human primates, the vocal patterns, even when they're quite complicated, are still innate. They don't require listening to uh, uh, an adult produce those vocal patterns. They don't require, at least as far as we know. There's always room for discovery, but uh, hearing doesn't seem to play an important role. And that's true in mice too. But in birds, it really does. And in humans, it really does. If you can't hear early in life, you don't develop a species typical vocalization if you're a songbird or if you're a human being. And sort of in the more positive sense, humans, juvenile humans, young, very young humans, and young songbirds are quite flexible in what they can learn. And that in songbirds, it's somewhat species dependent, but there are species that show remarkable flexibility in learning, and human infants transplanted to any um, spoken language culture will learn that spoken language and develop native fluency. So there's I think in that way much stronger parallels between birdsong and human speech than there is between mouse at least mouse courtship vocalizations and human speech.
That's awesome. That was actually going to be one of my questions, but I think you hit the nail on the head. I was going to ask how auditory experience can reshape vocal behavior, especially during these sensitive, like developmental periods. But I guess now that you've sort of touched on that, I want to ask, what are some of the biggest open questions that you and your lab are asking or would like to ask going forward?
Well, going to that second theme first, what motivates any animal to produce movement? I mean, that really spontaneous movement is something that is an essential part of our own repertoire. Uh, Spontaneous speech is an important part of our own repertoire. People speak spontaneously a huge amount every day. I looked this up a little while ago, and it's thousands and thousands of words per day, and there's a range, but that's not all in response to hearing somebody. We generate people talk to themselves, people speak out loud, people initiate conversation. Those are all evident, all lines of evidence that there's a spontaneity and a kind of just a generative process of behavior that's really fascinating. And anybody who studies animal behavior and has their favorite animal, a bird or uh, a mammal or a reptile or an amphibian or a fish, will note that the animals display movement, and it's not always clearly purposeful. It's not always like, oh, it's not always reflexive, and it's not always obviously goal driven. And so, what the role and what the genesis of those spontaneous movements may be, I think, is a really major question. And part of that has to do, at least in birdsong, with for us examining the linkage between hypothalamic circuits that control behavior, and particularly reproductive behavior, generally in all vertebrates, and what the relationship is to the machinery in the forebrain that is important to learning and producing song. So that's one. The other, which relates to the first theme of motor learning, the juvenile bird's practice phase, where it's learning how to sing, is really what is the discrete synaptic machinery in the brain that supports that. And we have published a paper recently looking at dopamine signaling in a specialized part of the bird's basal ganglia. And the basal ganglia are part of the forebrain in all mammals and birds, all vertebrates, maybe all chordates, actually, that is really important to motor learning, to reinforcement learning, that is, learning by trial and error and then being reinforced as to what is a better or worse outcome, depending on the behavior you exhibited, linking movements together in sequences, and so on. So those are all roles served, we think, in part by the basal ganglia and its interactions with other parts of the brain. So dopamine signaling in the basal ganglia turns out to be really important for reinforcement, particularly reinforcement in classical conditioning, where you learn by getting punished or rewarded. What's intriguing about the bird is there's no explicit punishment or reward. It just learns by doing and developing a roadmap of what's better or worse based on this internal target that it memorized early in life. And there's something intrinsically reinforcing about generating the behavior. That, again, I would posit is really very human-like. We do a lot of things because we like to, not because somebody tells us we should. And that's really, to me, really intriguing. And if I were to critique uh, aspects of modern neuroscience, is that there's too little attention paid to what the animal, the subject we're studying, is interested in doing, as opposed to what we want it to do. And classical conditioning is more a framework of shaping behavior through reinforcement, but not necessarily what the animal would naturally gravitate towards doing.
Hmm. That's really interesting. I I was going to um yeah, that learning stage, and then the ex intrinsic versus extrinsic motivations in these lab testing environments. Do you think that could have some confounding effect on the results of past or modern neuroscience? Those human-driven motivations versus what the animals are trying to do, or
Well, we and other animals learn a lot by outcome. Like, did this result in a good or bad outcome? Did we find food or not? Or, if I stuck my finger in a wall socket, would I do it again? No, I mean,
yeah.
those are, those are, I did that, by the way, when I was about 4 or 5, and just to find out what would happen. Nothing good. Um, but I never did it again. And I think in that sense, that framework is still really, really valuable. It's just that there are forms of learning that don't seem to require that explicit punishment or reward, and that's a special. I think if it involves reinforcement learning, and we think it does, or at least in birdsong, we think it uses the same underlying machinery as extrinsically reinforced learning. The question is, just twofold. One of which is what motivates you to do the behavior in the first place. If there's no immediate outcome that you can judge as rewarding. So the brain must have evolved in some way for that kind of learning to specify, yeah, this is a better outcome, and in an evolutionary sense, it's better you can produce it. And it's easy to see how that would work with birdsong, because birdsong is used for courtship. And if a juvenile bird fails to learn its species typical song, it has a really difficult time mating. Um, in a natural setting, it would be a dead end. So you can see how over evolutionary time selection would have favored uh, intrinsic reinforcement of the behavior, spontaneous generation of the behavior, and intrinsic sort of motivation to learn. It's uh, hard to believe that wouldn't be the case for humans as
Hmm.
well.
Yeah. So, as you've been talking, I've been hearing so many parallels between human and songbird vocalization and human language acquisition. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the techniques that you use to answer these questions. So, your lab uses things from like multiphoton imaging to electrophysiology to optogenetics and so many more methods. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask how you would work to pinpoint a methodology or technique for any given question, or if combining methods has ever revealed something you wouldn't have been able to see otherwise.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer that in just a second. But a corrective for a general audience that might include linguists. So the more direct analogy is between birdsong learning and speech learning.
Hmm.
Language is that's a speech is a medium for a language, but language is something beyond that. And I would say that birdsong and language diverge in that there's not an obvious semantic content or structure to bird song. It's more maybe akin to an emotional vocalization like crying or laughing, but even there, I think there are people in the birdsong field, Tim Gentner out at UCSD, who would say there are still aspects of birdsong that share features of language like syntax, recursive syntax, and so on, which Noam Chomsky would say is a defining feature of language. But just just to qualify it, I wouldn't make a claim that it's like language learning, which has many, many layers to it and
Mhm.
isn't really dependent on vocalization per se. You could learn sign language if you were born without hearing, for example, and develop fluency in language that doesn't require the spoken word. But in terms of the technology, it's a revolution. I mean, that's the thing to convey to an audience of non-scientists is that the incredibly wise and generous investment of the federal taxpayer in basic science over the last, well, 7 decades of NIH funded research, but maybe more, precisely over the last 20 years or so, where neuroscience in my field, where funding for technology has really resulted in tremendous advances. And those come in the flavors you mentioned. So optogenetics and optical methods for measuring endogenous neurotransmitters and neuromodulators. Those collectively are game-changing technologies. Uh, Array recording technologies, which include multi-electrode array recordings, high density, the kind of champion device right now is something called NeuroPixels, which was developed through a consortium effort that is an array on something sort of the dimensions of a sewing needle that has 1,000 or close to 1,000 individual recording sites on it. So extremely high density, um, printed, lithographic semiconductor technology for printing structure at that scale. And then um, optical methods, which include multiphoton imaging that allows relatively deep imaging in the brain down to half a millimeter to a millimeter in depth with extremely high resolution. So light microscopic resolution on the micron scale. Uh, so that enables us to image really fine structures that are the pre and post synaptic elements of synapses in the brain, and that's been huge. But the other thing is, and this is, I think, very relevant to your expertise, is the excuse me, the application of AI to data and machine learning tools um, for neural data have been huge. But I would say that equally or even greater uh, advances have been made by using these tools to analyze behavior.
Mhm.
And that's certainly true in our work, where in collaboration with John Pearson, who's a computational scientist here at Duke, we've been able to apply variational autoencoders and artificial neural nets to quantify this process of practice and learning in juvenile birds, literally one rendition at a time. And when you're talking about a data set that has, say, anywhere from 100,000 to 500,000 renditions, that's a heavy lift in the pre-AI world. I mean, you just couldn't, getting a handle on those large data sets was really hard. And so I would say that in some ways, I view that as the really unifying advance because you can use that to analyze behavior exhaustively, and you can also use it to look for correlations in really large populations of neural data and look for structure in those populations, which is a high dimensional data set, and relate it to the often equally high dimensional data set of behavior. And we're just at very early stages of doing that, but I would say that, as somebody who's been active in neuroscience for more than 4 decades, that convergence of technology, kind of how do you acquire data, genetic tools, uh, engineering tools, and then how do you analyze it using AI and other um, computational methods. That's been a game changer.
Yeah, that's incredible. And with this revolution, uh, if you imagine the next 5 or 10 years of your field, what breakthroughs do you think we'll see on about the data analysis side, but also is there something that you hope to find in the next decade or so with this revolution in technology?
Well, I appreciate your faith in me. A decade, maybe a little bit long timeline, but for me, but for the field, I would say, the realization of this convergence I just mentioned. I mean, we're just at early days of unifying this, but my point about how you look at behavior and part of the reason for creating experimental protocols and kind of in a way artificially constrained behaviors is because you can quantify them in the old school way. And just, if you said, well, let's let the animal free run or a group of animals free run, what would you do with that? And there are people like Bob Dada up at Harvard, Jeff Markowitz at Georgia Tech, uh, others who have really gone far in the mouse in just trying to analyze what spontaneous behavior in the mouse looks like and what's sort of um, the lexicon or the library of elementary movements that animals make, of mice make, and how are they organized into sequential movements. And Bob would argue that there are a really pretty finite number of elementary movements if you just image with a video camera in 3D with a camera array. You look at the animal's spontaneous behavior, there's a pretty finite number of movements or gestures, and they're organized in ways that are hierarchical and can be made sense of. So I think, a goal is to take that kind of insight and understand what the brain mechanisms are that are supporting the spontaneous generation of movement. And why does that matter? Well, it matters for its own sake because it's really fascinating. It matters because if we're going to understand how to tackle neurodegenerative diseases or problems of, higher order brain function, understanding what the elementary organization of movement is will be essential to uh, getting at how do you restore normal coding for those movements or build brain machine interfaces or just machines, exoskeletons, for example, that can move in natural ways to support us when the nervous system is dysfunctional.
That's incredible. And my last question to you is, what is your advice for the next generation of neuroscientists coming into the field now?
Well, use behavior as an organizational principle from the get-go. I think, with a few exceptions, a purely reductionist approach is going to be less and less fruitful for understanding brain function, with some important exceptions. I mean, sensory transduction, I think, still depends on, understanding it still depends on that level of interrogation. But the brain is the organ of behavior. And if you're interested in neuroscience, I think it really pays to come at it from a behavioral perspective first and foremost. The second is, I would be really, for a young neuroscientist, I would be looking for, in a sense, evolution to help me understand behavior, because birdsong is a really great example of this, and it's been integrated into neuroscience for many, many decades, fortunately for me. But what is an advantage there is that through quirks of evolution we don't fully understand, this group of birds learned how to sing. They learned how to culturally transmit their behavior from one generation to the next, their vocal behavior. And there are thousands of species of songbirds, and we've only looked at a few of them. And there are lots of variations, like, lyrebirds that seem to be almost completely flexible in what they can learn. There are other birds that learn remarkably complex repertoires that they transmit, you know, from one generation to the next, like European nightingales being an example of that. Um, and there are others that are more limited. So what are the brain mechanisms that support flexibility versus rigidity in behavior? And one could imagine a comparative study, more of a genomic study or transcriptomic study, which tried to look at that. So I think that's really important. Um, and I'm just giving an example from birdsong, but if you look across the whole, taxonomic spectrum, you could find many, many examples of this. I mean, insect behavior being great. I mean, because insects have been around for even longer than terrestrial vertebrates, and they have some just the diversity of behavior and ecological specialization is staggering. And while we know some about a few species of insects, I mean, the fruit fly being a great example, and know some about economically important species like agricultural pests. We don't know a lot about the more obscure and specialized species that might have some really important behavior to tell us about. So I just see that as kind of, it's not really neuroscience per se, it's more of a biological framework for, understanding the brain.
Yeah, and I think that's really important to keep in mind that as we're moving forward to like a more data-driven world, keeping the biology and the evolution in mind as we move forward is going to be the key to making the greatest discoveries we can. So, yeah. Thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate it, and I hope that our club can gain a lot from this. Um, Thank you.